to talk about food justice. So this is Benji Ballmer. He started his journey 14 years ago when he began to grow his own food. And it spiraled into a love affair with great ingredients, but quickly turned scary in the face of our growing food crisis. Not one to back down from a challenge, he began to imagine and build a local food system that would be entirely reliant upon the great work being done by Ohio's best food growers and producers. So he founded Yellowbird Foodshed, which is right here in Mount Vernon, and it serves the Central Ohio Foodshed with community-sustained agriculture. And then this is Steve Brescia. He is the co-founder and executive director of Groundswell International. He's also my dad. He has been working in sustainable agriculture for about 30 years. But Groundswell is 10 years old this year. They work in 10 countries doing agroecology, sustainable agriculture stuff that he will explain to you better than I can.
So Steve and I met maybe 2 years ago. There was a play that was done about some stories in Knox County. We were at it. It kind of revolved around, I don't know if you had written it or directed up a little bit of all that. And when you meet somebody in a like a rubbing elbows kind of a setting, and you have about 5 minutes, we were like, you know what, we probably should just jump on a call, like with no agenda other than we know that there's more conversation that we need to have together. And so we did that and had a call, and then he sent me his book and I read that. But as it swings back to this, like it's a really cool thing. For the little bit that we've talked, what he's doing is just super important work in terms of all of the world that he sees. Like, I live in a very closed environment. I'm in Knox County. Maybe I get to Columbus 2 or 3 times a week. I'm from Findlay. Ohio's kind of my thing, and so that's what I know. But then to hear, oh, what we're doing in Ohio is being done all over the planet in their environments and in their ecology, and that's what's so fascinating about what you do and how you look at the book and all these different stories of like, oh, this is what works here and this is what works here. And they're not trying to do something that works somewhere else necessarily unless it makes sense for the place that they're in. And so I think that's what is awesome about what you bring to the table. And so we're going to just kind of question back and forth with some general questions and get a conversation going. And then hopefully we'll just keep opening it up to, as you have thoughts or things that you want to talk about, that's kind of how we'll let the hour go. So.
Sounds great, and I don't know if I can compete with that beautiful introduction of you, but I think people know you locally, and you're obviously good at talking and sharing your. But yeah, like Benji said, we had just a great connection, and it was fun to see a character acting his story in this play, and then talk to him afterwards. And yeah, so we thought the opportunity to talk about both locally and globally how the issue of food justice connects to everything that people are talking about today. And I wanted to give a shout out and thanks to Melina for your great words this morning and introductions, and hope I feel a little sort of excited to be here and scattered, but I'm hoping we can connect pieces and connect dots about a lot of the kinds of issues you were raising and that I think this day is about. So I think that's part of the exciting opportunity. So I think what we're going to do, again, we're not super organized, but just go back and forth about what are some of the, why is the food and agricultural system broken? What needs to change? What are some of the problems? What are some of the solutions that you're working on locally and us and others are working on globally? How does it connect to issues of climate and what young people are doing, and then just kind of open up the dialogue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
At some point I might do like a 5-minute just video from one of our programs in Burkina Faso as an introduction, but do you want to start with kind of the local stuff? You want me to start with the global stuff?
Well, yeah, maybe I'll start with a real giant topic. And this is what I thought of this morning. I woke up and I'm like, I'm looking at the questions and this is the thing that dawns on me day in and day out. And it actually is from a book that I read last year. Gabe gave it to me, who you may know. And it was the first time I had read it, but it was called Ishmael. It's about this gorilla that talks to this man. And that's really the whole book. It's this discourse, but it boils down to one thing. We're one of the first groups of people, and when I say first, I mean like in the last 100 years-ish, that has decided that, or looked at the world through this lens of that the environment is something that we're in control of, that we're the deciders of what's going to happen, and we don't really care what decisions that we make and how it affects and plays out over the long term, where ancient civilizations before us leading up to, you know, the point where we're at kind of in the science revolution is, you know, you look at the ancient texts and you see that if it rained and if the sun came out at the right time, you had appeased the gods. You know, this was a divine intervention that was giving us this mystical thing that allowed food to grow to sustain us, right? We were so connected to where our food was coming from that it wasn't a question of justice or is this fair or is this whatever. You just did what you had to do to feed yourselves, right? We went from like nomadic culture to, okay, we're kind of starting to create agriculture, and we can set up longer term housing, and we can build our metropolitan areas around it. And I just mean, you know, villages, and okay, well, now we can grow food and we can control it. Well, we've continued to do that to the point where we've gotten, I think, so divorced from our relationship to all of it that now it's just another thing that we can look at and diagnose and try to create like explanation around. And then when you step back from that and you look and you're like, wait a second, this is the universe we're talking about. I'm a grain of sand on the seashore of this giant thing that has been interrelating with itself for billions of years. And now I step in and think, oh, like, you know, it's not going so hot. Like, what am I going to do to fix the thing? And so that's when I look at that, and then I look at the issues and I'm like, okay, my core mission is to try to reconnect the human individual to where their food is coming from. That's our whole Yellowbird mission. Because I think that all of the issues after that, if you're asking that question and asking who grew my food, that's the baseline for reconnecting back to the proper questions. And you know, you look at now, and I'm not saying divorce, I'm not saying don't get rid of science. All I'm saying is that the science now is showing, you know, that the microbiome in the soil is the same microbiome that's in our gut. And so when you feed the soil right, you're feeding your gut right. What we're made up of is literally the bacteria that makes up the soil as well. Like, and when you start to connect those pieces and make those things start to jive together, I think you start heading down a path of restoration. I don't think the question is, and you have to see if you agree with me. It's not if it's broken. If our food system and our ecology and you know, our environmental crisis, if it's broken or if it's happening, it is happening and it is broken. What are we going to do about it as individuals and collectively to shine the light on it?
Yes, it is broken. I fully agree, and I think there's also solutions, right? And so we have a crisis, and sometimes out of crisis comes positive change, or either it does or it doesn't, but that's our opportunity. And I also think we have a delivery mechanism, which is us, which is human beings, and our ability to work together, organize together, learn from each other all over the world, and generate the solutions that are out there. A couple of statistics, you know, related to globally, and again, our focus is a global one, and I think it's great that a lot of the discussion in this conference is more local, which is terrific. Is that, you know, there are about a third of the world's population, 2.5 billion people out of about 7.5 billion, are family farmers and food producers. You know, smallholders, and many of those people, some of the poorest people in the world, around the world. They are, so, and there's always this debate of how are we going to feed the world? Where's it, you know, the food going to come from? And we started initially with a focus on, you know, poverty and justice and social movements in different countries around the world. And have found over the years that this is what works. It's the appropriate kind of agriculture that people can own, create, and spread in a way that works. But one statistic right now is that those 2.5 billion people produce about 70% of the food consumed in the world, and they only use 30% of the resources. So the water, the inputs, the land, etc. So there already is a solution about who's feeding the world. And then another sort of myth out there, and then industrialized agriculture, which is the opposite model, is using about 70% of the resources and only producing about 30% of the food. And part of the reason is because a lot goes into biofuels and animal feed and things like that. So we do have these solutions, and it's, you know, the obvious thing is let's scale up agroecology, as we call it, sustainable agriculture, family farmer agriculture, local control, local democracy, local economies, as opposed to scaling out industrialized agricultural and technological inputs. And then, we'll talk more about is, what we've learned about how to do that with farmers leading the process all over the world. In many cases, women, and mamas of black mamas and mamas of color from Haiti and Burkina Faso and Honduras and different places, and want to talk more about that in a minute. But they are doing most of the farming work in the world, and in many cases are migrating and are have a different connection to the land in many cases. So I think that's a huge part of the solution as well. So
yeah.
Sorry, just one other point on climate change. There is again, we're facing the reality of this crisis and different statistics, but 25 to 50% of the greenhouse gases and the gases and climate change impacts coming from industrialized agriculture, both use of fertilizers, destruction of land, et cetera, different reasons. And I don't know if people are familiar with a book called Project Drawdown, which is also a website and a whole scientific sort of community of research. But the question is, what are the 100 best solutions in the world to take the carbon out of the atmosphere and reverse climate change? And about half of them, I'm generalizing, are related to food. How we produce food, how we consume food, how we transport food. So again, these solutions come together in win-win ways, but we're up against some big forces, which I think you're living, in your daily life about how do we create these changes.
Yeah. Well, so one of my favorite quotes is super short, and it's Wendell Berry, who is one of my favorites, maybe many of our favorites, and he has said, eating is an agricultural act. And so, as it relates to what I said before about how you're connected to your food system, 3 times a day, generally you're eating, and when you do, you're casting a vote. You're spending your dollar, which is the thing that moves the needle everywhere and on all the time, to say, I'm okay with where this food is coming from, how the person was treated that grew it, and what they were paid, how the land was treated in the growing of that food, and how it works in my own body. I'm okay eating this thing, whatever it is. Now, you're young enough, most of you in here are young enough, you're still super resilient. Like, the thing that I wouldn't have recognized at 20 was that, I'm going to be 40, and when I'm 38 now, and when I am, I'm going to, if I eat a half of a cinnamon roll, my morning's gone. I mean, you can forget it. I'm in a fog the rest of that morning. When you're a kid, when you're 20, you can stay up as late as you want, you can do whatever you want, you can eat whatever you want, and you're so resilient you don't feel the effects of it. Well, at some point, you're going to, and when you do, pay attention, because some of those indicators are the things that are like, hey, you probably should have been paying attention to this 10 years ago. You just didn't know because you didn't have the indicators. And so when you're eating, it's just the same as the clothes that you wear. I wear a shirt, and I'm saying, listen, I'm okay with how this material was grown, the people that put it together, what it costs, the company that's selling it. I'm complicit in all that as far as I'm concerned. Now, we're all walking hypocrisy, hypocrites, because it's so hard to get it all right. But eating is so commonplace. We do it, we all do it. We all have probably done it already today. And so every single time that you're eating something, you're participating in the system that we're talking about. And so that's where, in real briefly, literally in a minute or less, industrialized agriculture versus sustainable agriculture, or what we're talking about. I wouldn't have known what it was at your age, so let me just tell you in very generalized terms. Industrial agriculture is the big system that you see all of the fields that surround us doing, where they're growing corn, wheat, or soy for the most part, using giant tractors that one person can man. It's not heavy labor. It's heavily reliant upon chemical inputs and fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides so that you can do that. Now, we also probably all know that corn that you're seeing in the field that you drive by, that's not edible. You can't take an ear of that corn off of the stalk and eat it. You could, and you wouldn't die, but that's not the sweet corn that you think, like, that we grow up eating in the fall. sustainable agriculture, anywhere from an urban farm that has one plot that's as big as this table and it's somebody just growing food for themselves and their family or their community, all the way up to maybe 20, 30, 50 acres, depending on what you might be doing in that. But that's, it's small scale, an individual that's doing something that requires a lot of labor, hopefully very little chemical inputs, and in doing it correctly, actually regenerates and leaves more in the system, in the nature system, than what was taken out. So that the inputs that you put into the ground, and then even when you harvest out, leaves more than what you took. So not even a leave no trace mentality, but a leave more than what I started with mentality. So those are the two things. But
yeah. So maybe we can transition to practically what do we do and what do you do to try to build these alternatives, and then see where it takes us. And again, connecting back to some of Melina's words this morning. I mean, the idea is about what is an environmentalist and what motivates us. Ultimately, this is about human behavior and how do people change their behavior or adapt their behavior or innovate and learn, and what drives that and how they organize together. And the role of women, as I mentioned, and the spiritual component. She had interesting comments, which looks like she had to leave, but I wanted to ask her about the importance of the spiritual component in these movements, and that happens at various levels. But so what I'd like to do, if I could, is just explain a little bit about how we work, and then show a 5-minute video just to kind of ground it from our work in West Africa and Burkina Faso. So we. In terms of it starts with human beings. It starts with community organization. It starts with many times women's groups coming together in groups of 10 or so people, recognizing often these are some of the poorest, most marginalized people in the world, often illiterate, children who are malnourished and stunted in their growth often, and a motivation there to how can they help their children avoid those kinds of situations and thrive. But what we find is that people are coming together, analyzing what knowledge works together, experimenting on their own farms to test things in a way to how can I improve my soil management, how can I improve my diversity of my farms, how can I conserve soil or improve it with cover crops or green manures which fix nitrogen or put organic matter into the soil, testing different things, and then they becoming the experts by discovering on their own farm what increased my production 50% or 100%, and that's inspiring, right, for people. And then doing that as a group, and then they becoming the teachers, farmer to farmer, to teach others. So it's this farmer experimentation piece, because you have to have solutions that work. I mean, any farmer, if it doesn't work, you can talk all the theory you want, right, but if it doesn't work, ecologically and economically and everything else, people aren't going to do it. They're trying to survive, and then spreading it farmer to farmer. And then connecting to the local markets piece, which I think you have a lot of experience in, and we're trying to learn more about. But unless people are consuming local food and buying local food, a lot of times in many countries around the world, it's I'm eating imported Miami rice in Haiti because it's better, it's foreign, etc. But that displaces local farmers' production. And so how do you promote the consumption of local food, and then also the policies, the right kind of policies to support it. So should I show this 5-minute video just real quick, and kind of give some of those elements? It's in local language in Burkina Faso and with subtitles. So how do I get rid of this? So hopefully it'll work.
Tidaba na bamba ni tele pakate ko tidam ni atima ma ka tinga ti pero ya livale ke tu belo ke tele de yana ka ke na te tu metiel na ka ba ta ba la yo to mo pa ka na ka ma wan ni kim da te te aka da anti ke tun ku la wa ran jena na ni ko na ne to ro baya ke kenya ku jam ji ma ko be warja anto ba ber na be ke matana pa ber mpia polle mpia Bukan yang terkini ya. Kalau dijual ke yang baik, ayah pian juga kakak dia menjaga orang yang berbeda.
Our idea is to make sure we can help, we can work with farmers' organization to prevent such cases of food crisis in their communities.
Dan sini bang, sering punya kuali ke menterba, ubang berpuluh farm pun bukan bahasa kemudian cuaca. Kemudian saya bangun dulu, telah berzai di dalam ini. Mana sini tempat lambang, telah beri, itu berak keluar juga, dicuak, dikirku, ala cuak pun punya, balik dan nak sih yang bercakap cuak, baca kemudian dia ceritakan tuku.
Faisant la formation des formateurs, chaque paysan qui apprend à d'autres, qui apprennent à leurs voisins, à leurs camarades. Cela permet de toucher un grand nombre de communautés ou de populations dans un temps relativement court.
We focus on women because these women are struggling for everything in the family, and they just need this type of support, training, awareness raising.
Une autre chose que nous faisons dans les communautés, c'est d'identifier des groupes de femmes qui sont organisées et qui veulent bien travailler, particulièrement dans ce qui concerne le maraîchage. Nous les appuyons à travers la formation, à travers aussi un appui à un petit équipement pour pouvoir faire le matériel à la fois.
Si vous pouvez nous attendre, on y a un petit peu de temps, pipi izera kuizwa ni paida ma la bilbo kandi ka banka ni tumpura kusani tanapang ya na tondo ya la ati tondo ni ya tondo tondo zini ni ya lo ko ki kambe pasi ni zero to masa wale simuo manga twindi kumape wala zaka pour nous ntara kama uko ngoro twangire ko la umbasu ko dai
Dépend de ce changement, c'est un système de crédit qui permet aux femmes de mobiliser leurs propres ressources financières et de partager entre elles pour celles d'entre elles qui ont besoin d'entreprendre quelques petits commerces, quelques activités de petits commerces. Le deuxième élément important dans ce système, c'est que ça va augmenter, améliorer le leadership féminin. Nous souhaitons avoir un Burkina où tout le monde mange à sa faim, un Burkina sans famine, sans malnutrition.
I think that this is something helping not only the family but the whole country, because being able to care for the children, those are the adults of tomorrow, the future of the country.
Pia Burkina Faso, kama tukianza kufanya bayani tena, sana kwa Burkina Faso tunakuja kutoka duniani kwa njia ya aina ya
So I just want to read one sentence and then kind of ask you a question, Benji, in terms of So Groundswell International, we are a collective of organizations like this one organization, Burkina Faso, and that's sort of the name, that we're doing this as a collective of organizations together, learning from each other. And when we see, communities and farmers like this, we see power. They are the agents of change that can really hold the solutions and spread them. And that's what I see in your work locally. I mean, people trying to connect the farming pieces to the local markets pieces. So I'd really like to hear about how that works. And I just wanted to read one sentence, from this book, that we produced along these lines, saying that there are 2.5 billion people in the world on 500 million farms involved with smallholder family agricultural and food production. Their creative capacity to farm productively and sustainably with nature instead of against it is perhaps the most powerful force that can be unleashed to overcome the interlinking challenges of hunger, poverty, climate change, and environmental degradation. And this is the essence of agroecology. So again, I think this is what you are doing and living, and as a farmer, as a guy trying to create with others, I'm sure, local markets. So can you talk to us about how you're doing that and what the challenges are?
Yeah, so one of the most powerful things that happened to me 15 years ago was I started growing food. I grew up on Taco Bell and macaroni and cheese, and I started growing food, and all the light bulbs started going off in my being. And when I did, I just took a deep dive as fast as I could and figured out that the food system was broken, and here was why. My solution at the time was I was going to just grow food, have a little 5-acre farm, start a family, have chickens, do rotational grazing, do all these different things that I thought would be what I was going to spend the rest of my life doing. And then I saw the bigger picture of the food system and how it had become a centralized, commercialized, industrialized machine. And so I thought, if I could go out, because everyone is fighting for the same piece of the pie. If you're growing food at that level, of course for them, they're fighting hunger. For us, we're not in that situation. We're pretty well, none of us are going to starve because we can go get cheap food if we would need to. But in our situation, it's can we create a model that would actually pay the food grower enough money to be able to do this thing as that's their occupation. Right now, very few people grow food on a sustainable level, and that's the only thing they do because they don't make enough money to keep, to pay their mortgage. So, they've got to be a fireman and grow food, or they've got to be a school teacher and grow food, or they've got to be whatever. And my thing was, well, what if I can get enough people built up to buy the food that I can start to work backwards to the food growers that are doing it so well, and then put them into enough production that they can then sustain their living based upon, just growing food. And so that's where the Yellowbird was birthed. And I moved down here from Findlay so that I could get closer to the city, because in my mind, I'm like, no small town is going to be able to support this in and of itself. We're going to have to be able to reach a metropolitan area. So in telling the story in the beginning of all the growers that I had met up with and was starting to network with, and how were they doing it, and what were they growing, and how was it, relating back to their land as the best solution for that piece that they had, and then working that together to be able to create a product, in a consumeristic society that I could push out the front end. And so it was kind of a thing back and forth. In the beginning, I'm going to the growers and I'm going to their farms. Hey, how are you doing it? What are you doing? What's working? What's not working? What are you good at? Then going out into the marketplace. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. or student or whoever might be buying the food, are you interested in this issue? Because in my mind, it's a huge issue, but maybe it's not for you. Maybe I need to start raising awareness there. And that's what a lot of that thing is that I have to do, is I have to go out and I've got to tell people, hey, this is the dire truth about our food system, and you've been hoodwinked into thinking that everything's okay and it's going to be okay on into perpetuity, right? Into forever. And it's not going to be based upon this, this, and this. So now, if I can back out of that relationship and I can say, hey, buyer, start thinking about who grew your food. Hey, grower, let me start to connect you to the buyer, and then I can back out of the equation, and these two can shake hands, even if it's just virtually. It may not be physically. They might not actually be on the farm. But how did I do it, right? If anybody see Portlandia, you take an animal and you take a color and you slap them together and you have a company, right? This somebody will get behind. So that's essentially what happened. I knew that I had to create what I call the monster. I had to be able to speak the language of a consumeristic society in a way that got people excited out here about this thing, because if I didn't, it would continue to go on as it had gone on for the last 10, 20, 50 years. And so that's what I've done. I've kind of created this, at the end of the day, I'm still selling broccoli. That's what it boils down to. You can get broccoli at Walmart. I don't necessarily have something that somebody else doesn't have. I've got it done, though, a different way. And because of that, here's all the check boxes that are being checked. It's healthier, less fossil fuels, more money into the pocket of the grower, the earth's being treated better. It's on down the way. And so that's where we've literally created a group of, in the beginning I had 7 people who said to me, I'll buy everything that you grow. And that's how the Yellowbird started. And then I started networking with other growers, and we've built it to the point where we've got 1,000 people that in and around Central Ohio, including Knox County, all the way up to Findlay, where I'm from, back in the day, 6 years ago, saying, I'm in. Okay, you've sold me. What else can I learn? How else can I get to the growers? How else can I support them? My thinking is, if I can keep working back and forth, and I can keep growing this side, and I can keep buying on this side and finding more growers and encouraging more people, hey, listen, there is a future in this. It's not all in the Yellowbird. Grow for market, grow for restaurants, grow for whatever, but at the same time, let's work together for a small piece. Like if you would look at that total thing, I'm not going to speak for all that, right? Some of that used for something else, but let me also say, if you can do that, you might be able to do double that. Why wouldn't a small grower grow double of what they currently grow if they've got the space? The main reason is because they don't know if they can sell it. Anyone who's ever grown food has grown too much thinking they could sell it all, not been able to sell it, and then had to compost it or feed it to animals, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but doesn't provide money. And so that's where I'm like, listen, let's talk about how you can diversify and start to grow things at a level for us where you can start to put this into your portfolio and know, I'm going to sell this much at farmers markets this year, I'm going to sell this much to restaurants, but I'm also going to sell 5, 10, we've got growers that I paid 60 grand, 70 grand last year for their product because they grow so much good stuff. And so they keep coming back to me and they're like, hey, last year we did 30 with you. This year we did 60 with you. Do you think you've got the monster, in my words, the sales channel for me to grow $90,000 worth of food? I can do it. I'm just not going to, because I can't waste that time and energy to grow something that isn't sold. So that's what I've been working back and forth with, like, okay, boom, 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 jumping back and forth and slowly growing up both sides of those things. That's what our work is.
So can I ask a question? Yeah. And I admire what you're doing. So I think you weren't here for the morning opening.
I was not.
Yeah. But so, a couple of the issues she was raising as an urban woman from Los Angeles, or originally from, I think, Louisiana and not, or Texas maybe, not urban places. But the issues of, in our country, equity and policy, mm-hmm. So is it like a luxury good that people, higher income people can afford it? Or is there a way for lower income communities and communities of color to access what you're doing? And then because we wrestle with the same thing. Sure. Overseas. There's the production side, great, but if nobody's buying my food, how do I survive, right? Yeah. And how do I incentivize better soil management that solves climate change? If no one's paying for that,
right? That's exactly right.
And so the policy piece, are there certain policies that need to happen in terms of subsidies or supports from the government?
Sure. The biggest thing is that everybody in the United States is treated equally. So if you're a giant industrial farm, or you're a farm that has 5 acres, you pretty much fall under the same rules. Now there's a few exceptions, but the problem is that on a whole, the big certifying companies, the ODA, the USDA, the whatever, they don't want to mess with the small grower because it's just too much work and it's too cumbersome and they want it all to be big. So all the incentives are for the big. That started back in the Nixon administration when Earl Butz, who was the president of the agricultural United States Department of Agriculture, said, hey, get bigger, get out. The small farm needs to get rid. We're done with them. Plant fence row to fence row. We're going to pay for your corn, wheat, and soy as a government. And if you can't do that, then shut it down and get to the city and do something else. And so we've got to. That's where I'm trying to create. Okay, with it. So my thing is, as kind of a railer against the man, I guess you would call it, like, okay, you're going to do that, then I'm going to build my own food system right underneath your nose. And I'm going to create something that I've got buy-in with. And what that does then is it allows us to go backwards to places that can't, because if the question always is who's going to pay for it. Listen, the food that's being grown the right way, it doesn't cost the same amount as it does to grow it on a massive scale and sell it in Walmart. And so if no one's going to pay for that food, then the grower's not going to grow it. And so I tell the grower, listen, what do you have to get out of it with me to make it worth your time and effort? Because let me be the one then to go get it out of the consumer. So, unfortunately, my core demographic, and it's embarrassing to even say it, it's a 38-year-old white woman with 2 kids, a dual income of over $100,000, and at least a master's degree, but maybe even working on more in terms of their education. That's who's paying for my company to be able to run. Now, what I do is, I Robin Hood it, right? In my opinion, I'm taking that and I'm giving them what the best product available. It's not like I'm saying, well, here, I'm hoodwinking you and giving you garbage I bought at Walmart. But then I'm taking that and working it backwards into public school systems that can't afford to put real food on the table, and so they've got 80 cents a kid to be able to spend on food. I'm putting it back into areas like Whitehall, which would be one of the lower income areas in Columbus, who want to have access to this food but are a food desert and don't have access to it. So I use the money that I'm making here to be able to feed it backwards into some of the communities that wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And then they've got small programs through their public school system or through their public health department that they might be able to come up with a little bit of money to do a match. Hey, you have $10. Let's say the box costs 20 or whatever it is that I'm selling costs 20. You've got 10 as a public health system for Franklin County or Knox County or whatever, all match. And it's I don't even know what it'd be called, Michelle Obama's something, whatever. And so they're able to then come in and kind of work so that you have to pay something, but it is I'm still able to pay full price to the grower. So it's not like I've got to go back to the grower and say, hey, we could feed a bunch more people. They just can't afford it. Could we pay you cheaper prices on the food? Because then they're not going to make any money. And again, if it's not working for everybody, it's not working for anybody.
Yeah. So maybe just make a comment and see if you what questions or ideas or comments you guys have or what other issues you want to talk about. But I mean, again, part of the spirit and the purpose of Groundswell is to try to support this work in 10 countries around the world, but we're also trying to figure out how to connect, to these movements in the U.S. and initiatives, which was part of the initial inspiration for some of our conversations. And we haven't figured it out. I mean, there's obviously great stuff happening, but what's the value added, et cetera. So we're still working on that and hope to figure that out. But this idea of get bigger, get out. I mean, the problem is the food system is broken globally, right? So we have to be strong together. And I think, I was reading so 2 points: get bigger, get out. Right? There's Syngenta. There's a graph in this book from the big agricultural input company Syngenta, and their image of how farming will improve in Africa, and basically probably going the wrong way in terms of backwards. But how do you increase productivity of smallholder family farmers like the people you saw here? And the basic solution is they get more productive by buying inputs from Syngenta, genetically modified seeds, chemicals, pesticides, mechanization. But the secret, it's actually on their graph. It says the secret here, and then what happens? The farmers migrate out of agriculture. So 2.5 billion people, a third of the world's planet. That's the model. Leave agriculture, get bigger, get out. And where are they going to go? So part of the crisis and the opportunity right now is there is nowhere for them to go. There's not enough jobs in urban areas, and so farmers are now seen as a force that needs to lead the change in this way. And I was going to make another point, but I can't.
Well, let me jump in. The farmer's the rock star in this story. Listen, it's not the yellowbird. People love the yellowbird because we're cute and quirky and have great marketing. At the end of the day, I'm not the rock star in the equation. It's the grower that is. And so, in order to what our consumer and grower, our consumer base is saying, yes, okay, wow, you really taught me a lot, Yellowbird, about what's going on here, and all I'm really doing is trying to point all the arrows back to, listen, this is, and here's an indicator. When I start talking about the farms as the leading pitch in trying to sell food, people like it, but it doesn't cause them an emotional response to purchase it. When I start talking about how to get the consumer healthier or their children healthier, click, 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 click. People are buying, put that in my market. It's the most searched Google topic on the planet. How do I get healthier? And so when you start to show what this does, it's not just a, hey, am I hungry and you're going to feed me? It's, listen, we are in a health crisis as well. We haven't even talked about, and that is like, again, feeds right into it. And so now you're talking about eating different, eating better. And if you would do that, the demand for the food would skyrocket, because then all of a sudden now you're driving it from this side, and it's not a how cheap can I get my food? It's I'm willing to pay whatever I need to, instead of all the healthcare costs that we are associated with. And this is where I'm going to get my health from. And this is what I'm going to patronize in order to make this systemic change in my own life. And when you make the systemic change in your own life over and over and over again, it starts to spread to the community, to my reach, and then their networks, and then their networks. And now you've got something where, okay, boom, we've got now it's starting to feed back into the growers. And that's, I think, the power of your...
Yeah, no, I remembered my last point, and I wanted to open it up for questions. So, we need to change the operating system of our agricultural and food systems, right? There was an article read by Bill Gates recently, who funds a lot of agricultural work internationally with his foundation. And it's just, the operating system is always, what's the next app, what's the next technology, what's the next genetic modification that we can then patent and the company can sell it, right? But the solution is, what you're doing and what people in this video do. It's the innovation is human organization. I mean, you're innovating. That's the innovation. It's like, how do we organize as a society? How do we create democracy? How do we create economy? Yeah. And then innovating on farms as well in sustainable ways, which, ideally without the external inputs, but with local, working with nature and shutting against it. So I think that's the challenge and the opportunity that we all face is it's about human innovation, human organization at all these levels, of farming levels, building market levels, et cetera, communication levels. So.
I mean, but think about the common theme in this video. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa or you're down the street. Every person in this video is doing what? They're working. It takes work. It's not it's not an app. Everybody wants to develop an app. I can sit here and just start reeling in money based upon, people touching their phones.
And they're innovating, they're creating.
Yes, right.
Fast and furious. You're always figuring out the next problem. How do we deal with this or that challenge?
Right. And so that's where people are like, well, it'd create way too much labor. And I'm like, well, the last time I checked, there's a lot of people looking for work. Like, what if we thought, okay, if I'm going to work, like, what if I actually went and worked? And so that's, that's a giant piece of it.
So I think we have 15 minutes or so. If people have questions, and we can keep rambling on, as you can tell, but do people have comments or questions, or want to share stuff you're doing or ideas?
I was just really interested in the urban farming aspect. Well, I was interested in all of it, but I think that was most relevant. I live near Detroit, which is a total food desert, right? And there have been small movements for urban farming and education around healthy eating and sustainably, sustainably providing food to a very low income population. And so I was kind of wondering your input about these, urban situations, and how do we fix this issue, being conscious of economic issues and what's the word, boundaries, as well as health and health for the earth as well as for people, and kind of building up communities as well.
Yeah. Let me give you the I think maybe a direction you're headed. So it's a Yellowbird Foodshed. A food shed is just like a watershed. It's the geographic area that geography feeds, right? And my thing is that it's not, you don't want to scale bigger, you want to scale smaller. You want to tighten your circles. So if I can live in a community, like let's say it's an apartment building that's in an urban area, and there's a yard that might be 100 feet long by 40 feet wide, I could feed that entire building off of that yard if we did it right, and if there was people that there was a labor force from the building willing to take part in it. Now, it wouldn't take much, a couple of years of doing it to figure out what's the next step then? Well, we create a value-added product. We take, because half the year it's cold. So we take our tomatoes when we harvest them and we can them, right? These are skills that my grandparents or my great-grandparents were taught intrinsically. And so that would resurface. I've seen that resurgence in some of those skills, fermenting food, creating krauts and fermented beets and things like that are like, oh, this is how you take what I've grown in July and move it to January. And so my thing is, let's get the Foodshed lines smaller and let's feed an entire apartment building off of the yard right next to them. Not let's see how big we can scale this thing and can we take over the food industry. I want to stay small. I want to stay rogue.
And maybe I would just add back to this, connecting to some of the earlier themes, what motivates people to change, right? And as Melina was saying in the morning, a lot of the time it's our kids, right?
Yeah.
For all of us. I mean, me too. I've been doing this stuff internationally. I was doing political work, and then I had kids. Maria's the youngest one of 3, but it's like, then you're thinking about your kids' health and what I'm feeding them, and what kind of a human being am I that I can't feed my children healthy food, So I think the most impacted in terms of the malnutrition impacts and eating the junk food tend to be low-income communities, and Detroit and other places, and affected by all the health impacts, diabetes, etc. So that's the crisis, that's the opportunity, and I think there's so many different programs around these kinds of urban gardening in schools and education, but so much more that can be done, I think, to connect these dots and solve that crisis.
And like bringing in the economic justice, I think is big.
Absolutely.
It's like everyone wants to feed their kids. How can we make that?
It needs to be jobs. It needs to be an economic
Absolutely.
income. And
Absolutely.
the government should be. I mean, they're subsidizing big ag, right? So so that should be shift the subsidy there.
Right.
It's like let's put our money in the right place if that's what's required. I mean, you live that. I don't in the U.S. in terms of what's required,
I mean, it's true to one regard. To the other regard, it is. I'm stubborn, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want the government's money. And maybe I'll sink the ship because of it. I don't know, but it's like if we live in a free market society where our consumers are driving the needle based upon their purchasing, I may be stupid enough to think I can go convince enough people to put their money where their mouth is, and that's what it boils down to. Is it's like, where are we putting our dollars? And anybody that I talk to that's in your shoes, here's a very easy example. You go to Kenyon College, and I know that your tuition is astronomical, right? It's out the roof, as it is in all post-secondary education or whatever that might be. What is that money going to? Ask the question to the people who are spending it, because the food that you're eating every day in your cafes and in your whatever, that's your money that you're giving to them and saying, hey, go buy my food for me because I need it at this place because I've got class before and after and I can't go figure it all out. And they're going and spending it, and you think that they have your agenda in mind, or do you think that they have how cheap can I get it to be able to make the most money? And I'm not pointing the finger at Kenyon in particular. I'm just saying that's what corporations exist for, is to maximize the value for the shareholders. And so you've got to be aware of everywhere your money's going, and because you're saying, okay, spend my money here, or I'm going to spend it there, or I'm for this, or I'm whatever. And you got to be careful, because you find out pretty quickly that people don't have your best interest in mind, because it's just the nature of the beast. Any other questions? Yeah.
A question about Groundswell International. So does this is an organization that works with all of these other organizations around the world, and is it like already existing organizations, or do y'all help start organizations in these places? And if so, or any of this, could you also just speak to Melina's talk about like self-determination and like how is Groundswell International supporting this like autonomous like self-sufficiency and like power from the community itself?
Sure. So Groundswell was formed about 10 years ago by a group of people that have been doing this work together in some ways for 25, 30, before me, even 50 years, back to the 1970s, and coming up with, good methodology in terms of working with communities and farmers leading and not doing things for people, but them doing it for themselves and building their own capacity. And then when 10 years ago, when some of us worked for a previous organization that had a transition, and we had an opportunity to rethink how to structure this. So what we did is, as a collective, as an ecosystem, and we don't, the world doesn't need Groundswell Haiti, Groundswell Burkina Faso, but just as we see, it all starts with 10 women or men and women together, getting together under a tree, pulling the resources, learning together. We're stronger together than we are separately. So how can we connect the dots, learn from each other, support each other, get the message out, write a book, share the messages. So, the chain of work is, doing this work together, creating these programs together at a regional level. This video I didn't talk about a lot, but there's a soil fertility crisis related to burning of trees and organic matter, and there are solutions. So how do we scale those and learn from each other across 4 countries and share them at higher levels? But the chain is creating these programs like this together, and then the local NGO, non-governmental organization partners who are a part of the Groundswell, the members of Groundswell, doing the work on the ground. And then ultimately the communities are the ones who do the work. I mean, the people you see here, and they're building the capacity of women's groups. You saw like some savings and credit to pool their own resources, to learn about farming, to spread it, to start vegetable gardening, etc. So yeah, it's all about that vision of strengthening local capacity. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term food sovereignty, which is the same concept. And there are global movements, via Campesina, farmers movements, working for these things. But we're trying to support it from a practical level, from the ground up, and then plugging into networks that exist in sub-regions of countries or in regions of countries. But that's how we're trying to work together as a collective with that vision. And those are, the people you saw here are like local people and local staff around the world that are doing the work. Yes.
So my question is more for you, but so what is your opinion/attitude towards farmers markets? Because I know that they're a way for people, especially like in a suburbia, like where I live outside Chicago, where there's not as many farms around, but we're so close to them, like say in the city, and they have farmers markets that come in and like growers who give out their food, but it's only for certain months out of the year, and it's not like a sustainable thing. Because once the farmers market's gone, we go back to going to Jewel or
Sure.
Walmart for like our food.
Yeah.
So do you think it's a step in the right direction, or do you think it's
Well,
kind of not?
here's who likes farmers markets, the city groups, because it checks a box for them. Here's who doesn't like farmers markets: farmers. It's so inconsistent. It's so there's nobody shopping your stand. They're cherry picking. They want your best thing, and then they want that person's best thing and that person's best thing. So you go and spend 2 hours. Let's say you spend a day harvesting, 2 hours driving into the city, or an hour or whatever, an hour setting up. You're there for 2 or 3 hours. You might do $800 in sales. Let's just say it's even a big number, like $3,000 or something, that you're like, oh, okay, that's a pretty decent day or whatever. An hour tearing down, 2 hours back home. I got to unload at home. I have stuff I didn't sell. Now what do I do with that? All of that day, at the end of the day, you got $20 left over. And it's like, that doesn't, it's a model that has been around forever. And I think in certain areas it would probably work better than others. I just think in the States, we've created it as a, this is a very romantic way and whatever. Now, what it does do is it's a marketing thing. I would tell any grower, and that's how I started, was going to farmers markets with my own food, and I'm looking around and going, is everybody experiencing the same day I'm experiencing? Because I came here last week and did 400, today I've done 40, and I can't build a farm on that. And so what it is, though, is it's that direct connection. You start to grow your network, and if you work it right, it's your marketing day. So that's what I tell growers. Don't look at it as that this is a win-loss, whether you did this many sales or this many whatever. You're out in front of 5, 10, 50, 500 people, depending on what the market might be. You got to get, I tell every single grower, your logo's not cute enough and you don't put enough on social media. Now, that stinks because maybe they're not good at marketing. Maybe they don't have the money to go get a good logo. Maybe they don't know how to use social media. That's where I step in and say, let me just do it for you. But if I'm a small grower and I'm thinking I'm going to make a go of it as a small grower, before I ever put a seed in the ground, I'm getting a logo somebody can get behind, because that's the culture we live in. And I'm going to get a way to get my story out there. And so that's what you got to use the market as. And that's what I would, and we've never been to, as a company, Yellowbird, we never sell at farmers markets, haven't from the beginning, because I don't want to cannibalize that business from those growers that are already there. I want to add on to that for them if they want to be a part of that.
So thank you again both for being here and having this discussion. I'm someone who's become very interested in food systems and how our food system is broken, and working on fixing that. And as you've both already touched on, there are be picky about where we're buying food from. That's a real privilege to have, to be able to have the time to think about those things, have the money to decide where we're going to buy food from and what our diets might look like. It's a real privilege. And so I guess, I think the work that you're both doing is really amazing, kind of coming from a grassroots approach, building from the ground up. But I'm also wondering, since part of the ways in which our food system is broken is also kind of like Melina was saying, it's so much more intersectional. There are racial and social issues that are so intertwined with how our food system is broken. So how much do you both think that the work on our food systems needs to be kind of from the ground up, and how much needs to be focusing on influencing policy to make healthcare affordable to everybody and raising minimum wages and kind of working on these other social issues? Where's the balance with those two?
I'll take a first shot. So yes, that is a description of the dynamics, and it's others I'm sure I've experienced too. But Melina isn't here; she could share more. But it doesn't have to be a privilege, right? I mean, it's like as everybody cares about their children's health, as she was saying, and how do we allow for that, right? How do we provide the right supports for that? Build it into school systems, into education. She mentioned, I don't know the details, but doing work around educational curriculums and things like that. Recognize the racial and the economic realities behind it, and that the most negatively impacted people are the people of color, and low income, in terms of their health and all that. So that ought to be an agenda that we can get behind together as a society that's intersectional and look for the right kinds of solutions. And I know there's many experiments and efforts out there in urban areas all around the country, and people, doctors' prescriptions for buying healthy local vegetables and fruits and things like that. I'm not as much of an expert in those, but I do think there's an opportunity there and a need there, and I think that it ultimately, I mean, we are the agents of, all of us, collectively in different spaces of creating these changes and needing to name that this system needs to be changed and work together. And I think that's the opportunity, which is, complicated to figure out as to how can we each work in our own space to build this. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge and an opportunity. So you're working more directly.
Well, and it's just a personality thing, right? There's 50 people in here representing 50 different ways to do it. I couldn't care less about policy. I think it's a waste of time. I think but that's just my own personality. My thing is, I'm going to go in and just do what I want to do. I've always been that way since I was 10. I look backwards and I'm like, oh yeah, I just always just did what I wanted to do and what I saw needed to be done. And so that's where I come. For me, if policy changes, great, but I can't wait on that, and I can't spend my time lobbying with people who don't see it and don't get it. If you don't have eyes to see it, I'm done. I'm moving on to the next person who might. And so that's just, because when you listen to me, it's like drinking from a fire hose. People say that, it's like, so that's part of it. Yeah. So I've kind of learned how to tame that and be like, okay, this is kind of the package I've been given. What can I do with it? Now, what I would say practically to everybody is, if you want to start somewhere, grow something. Just grow. I mean, when I was your age, I was probably, it was like, I had a cannabis plant in the window of my dorm room kind of thing.
Oh my God.
Right? But what did that lead to? That led to seeing a seed in soil grow and be like, wow, this is where this comes from? And of course at the time it was a whole different mindset, but think about how that translates as you get older and you start to have kids, you start to start a family, you start to eat different, you start to, whatever it is, and you develop a passion around something. That's what led to, oh, wow, if I put a tomato in the ground, it does the same thing that thing did in college, right? And so now, I'm eating, anyone who says, you say, what was the best tomato you've ever eaten? Hands down, the response 99 out of 100 times is the tomato that I grew myself out in my backyard. And so when you start to do that, everything starts to connect, and you start to reconnect to things at a very small scale that lead to change at a very big scale. So that's where I would say, if you want to know what to do today, go get to Lowe's, and as much as I hate giving money to the man, and get a basil plant and put it in your window. Definitely not cannabis. Don't ever tell anybody I said for you to do that. And grow it. because basil goes with everything almost. And so, you've got a sandwich, you've got a salad, you've got macaroni and cheese, whatever it might be. All of a sudden it's like, oh, this thing that's growing here, I can eat this. And it's like, all that translates. I mean, that's all those folks are doing. They're hungry, and they know that in order to be able to feed themselves, they literally have to grow their food. That is dire. They can't go get another solution somewhere else. And so that is how change begins to happen, because you start to be the change and you're starting to do it yourself.
Yeah, I wanted to affirm the same spirit, basically, like let's just build it.
Yeah,
There's 1,000 different ways to do that. And anyway, any question?
I think I guess we all agree that sustainable farming can be quite expensive in terms of like affording to be able to afford sustainable farming as like a low income person. But last summer I was able to work with a group. I go to school near Charlotte, North Carolina, and I work with a nonprofit that essentially was able to collect donations from grocery stores and various local farmers. Essentially their leftover produce that they weren't able to sell and it might expire soon, they were able to collect and essentially give away on a donation basis at various farmers markets and food deserts in the Charlotte region. And all the produce was organic, and it was again donation based, but essentially a lot of people were able to come in and get free organic fresh produce. I'm wondering, I'm not from this region of the United States, I was wondering have you ever heard of something like this similar in Ohio, or would you be willing to like contribute to such an organization?
The gal behind you might know exactly what you're talking about. She gives her hand.
Yeah, we're from Worcester. It's about an hour away from here. And something that we're doing this summer in conjunction with Worcester Food Bank, I think, is working on farm to table, like direct farm to food bank kind of things, because a lot of farmers who say they have a lot of leftover produce, they don't sell it. What do they do with it? They compost it, feed it. And so what we're working on this summer is trying to get connections between farmers and food banks and things in the community to try and get that local fresh produce into our community.
Yeah, and what she's saying is those infrastructures already exist. We don't have to reinvent those. And I think that that's what you're really good at doing when you plug into what's already going on, which is people have, with noble causes over the last 50 years have built some giant ways to move food around. And I think that if you find a good one of those and you start to work something there, and it's happening. I rail on policy just because it's kind of my stance, and it's a caricature almost, but I know tons of people that are doing amazing work with policy and in giant corporations, the Mid-Ohio Food Bank that does millions of pounds of food, and they're in there working it for the benefit of the people who don't have access to it. And so it's kind of a shtick that I do, but really there are some giant things going on that you can plug into. And that's kind of the question that I keep my eyes open for, is it's like, well, is there a way to what I've got going here with this small little segment of the population, can I plug some of those growers into some other things that will allow them to have more avenues, and then those things are plugging that wonderful food down into channels that I'm just not in, which would be some of those lower income areas, underserved food deserts.
Speaking of food, is it lunchtime?
We're